This presentation is going to go into detail regarding how to build a marketing and sales program that can cost-effectively generate qualified sales leads in the shortest amount of time based on the lead generation paradigm, which we discussed in the earlier video. But in this series, we're going to get into the weeds, the how-to, if you will. By way of review, in the previous talk I explained that lead generation isn't some promotional tactic that you can bolt onto a failing marketing program in order to save it, and it isn't lead qualification, pay-per-lead email, blogging, or list acquisition either. Rather, lead generation is a very high-level concept that ties the marketing and sales functions together, which then manifests as strategies that are developed in support of the objective of generating and closing qualified sales leads. That is, the goal of the business is to make money, gain market share, dominate the market, or whatever you set. And the objective, that is the way to deliver that revenue, is to generate qualified sales leads, leads that close successfully and profitably, and hopefully relatively quickly. The strategies you employ to generate and close qualified leads come from the marketing and sales functions. And so your individual marketing plans and sales plans have to be subordinate to your lead generation objective. And the reason is, as we discussed previously, because that's the only way to have a meaningful amount of accountability in the program. That is, if your marketing strategy isn't specifically designed to generate qualified sales leads, then it's very likely that it won't do that. And if your sales strategy isn't integrated into that same program, it's very likely that it won't have anything to close. So make the generation of qualified leads the primary goal, and everything else will work out. Here's another view. The goal is for the company to make money. The objective, therefore, in order for the company to make money, is for it to generate and close qualified sales leads and to do it profitably and relatively quickly. The marketing and sales functions exist to create the various programs needed to make that happen, and the marketing mix and the various sales tools constitute all the tactics that folks use to generate and close those leads. To explain how the process works, we're going to use the development of a cold calling program as a model. This process works for every type of marketing and sales program, though, but it's a bit easier to understand if you see how the cold calling sausage is made. In a later video, we'll show you how to take the elements we develop here and apply them to things like email programs, branding, banner ads, sales training, and anything else you might want to use. But we use cold calling as a model also because it most clearly enables us to show how accountability works in the lead generation paradigm. And when it comes to solving the revenue problem, accountability is ultimately pretty important. So let's get started. If you're like most people who are responsible for generating leads and finding new business, you know that cold calling can be one of the most powerful weapons in your marketing arsenal, provided that you can do it well. Having an effective approach to cold calling means that you can generate more and better qualified sales leads and find more new business for your company faster, more consistently, and for a far lower cost and risk compared to advertising, direct mail, SEO, networking, trade shows, social media marketing, PR, or any of the hundreds of other so-called marketing solutions. The problem is, though, that it isn't easy to do, particularly with some products and in some markets. You may be challenged by bad lists, getting past gatekeepers, rejection, or inaccurate information on who the decision makers are. You may have trouble stimulating interest because people don't seem to respond to your message. You may be getting dumped into voicemail, or you may just be getting blocked by objections like no need, no interest, the presence of an incumbent vendor, or everyone's favorite objection, not now. These problems are exacerbated by the fact that most sales directors, call center managers, marketing professionals, and business owners simply don't know what works to generate a good lead on the phone, or anyone else for that matter in some cases. So they fall back on the numbers game, a classic case of doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result. Or they use the threat of firing to motivate excellent performance, a truly Darwinian solution for those who believe that creative destruction is capitalism's greatest virtue, when the real problem is that they basically don't know what they're doing. But other approaches to lead generation work even less well and often cost much more, at least if they're not built on a proper foundation. For example, while John Wanamaker said 100 years ago, "Half my advertising budget is wasted, I just don't know which half," today it is perfectly easy to waste your entire advertising budget. Likewise, networking is fine if you'd like trying to sell to people who can't buy, and email gets your website blacklisted. SEO is an arms race where only the only winners are the search providers. Using social media to generate leads is like trying to get nominated for Best Supporting Actor. Most PR is nothing but a bit bucket, and decision makers don't go to trade shows. So the pressure to perform ultimately falls back on the individual telemarketer, salesperson, or business development specialist. Pressure that usually just mounts until something or someone breaks. For many sales and marketing professionals, not being able to generate new business can quickly lead to missed expectations, revenue shortfalls, frustration, and job loss, particularly when other marketing activities aren't available to pick up the slack. And it's often not just you who suffers. If you're supposed to be making appointments for an outside salesperson, it means they may miss their numbers. The production department may have to cut back, and of course, your own family may pay a price for your poor performance. So while success can have many benefits, failure can pull the rug out from you, your job, your coworkers, and your company. On the other hand, as we said, success can have its benefits. Being able to generate a steady stream of high-quality leads and appointments is the linchpin for growth at many companies. It means revenue success, opportunity, and growth, not just for you, but for your entire company. Success is certainly more fun than failure, and it can feed on itself, leading to higher pay, promotion, and even faster growth rates as success, as they say, breeds success. That's why we're here, and this is where we want to go, to enable you to generate high-quality appointments and leads that lead to more sales, more income, and more fun while expending less time, effort, money, and frustration. So with that as our goal, let's drive it down a level, starting with how do we get there? One problem, as we said, is that most companies and most sales and marketing managers simply don't know what works when it comes to cold calling. Most resort to the old adage of smile and dial, or they tell you it's a numbers game and that the more calls you make, the more leads you'll get. But if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have a process that actually works, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is, as they say, the very definition of insanity. Today, however, you're going to learn exactly what works and how to make it work for you, how to get past gatekeepers and voicemail, how to reach decision makers, how to establish rapport and credibility, how to stimulate interest and uncover needs for your products or services, how to create urgency and stop the endless postponements, and how to persuade your prospects to want to meet and eventually buy. In short, how to generate high-quality leads that result in more sales at a lower cost with less time and effort, with more fun, and all the rewards that come with success. And again, we're going to show you how to do this for a cold calling program, but it works the same way regardless of the marketing mix you choose to use. So what does it mean to create demand? In our experience, it starts with finding a suspect, someone who could potentially buy your product or service. It then means engaging them in a conversation where you uncover their needs, pains, and problems, as well as their unrealized hopes, dreams, and goals with which you can help, and then getting them to want to solve these problems and achieve those goals, ideally sooner rather than later. It then means positioning your product or service as a solution, as a means to achieving those ends, and then getting the prospect to commit to a meeting with you or your rep to talk about it as a next step in the process of getting there. But creating demand and successful cold calling in particular is the quintessential case of making something out of nothing, or at least nothing more than a phone call. The classic model that we use for this process, dating way back to the 1930s, is AIDA. AIDA stands for getting the prospect's attention, stimulating their interest, getting them to desire or want to do something about it, and then getting them to actually act on that desire. Although it originally applied to consumer sales, we've found that these 4 steps are equally effective in B2B cold calling, and they provide an excellent model for designing both a cold call and a cold calling program. Consequently, that's what we're going to do today, design a cold calling program and your cold call around this AIDA model so you can make more money, have more fun, and achieve the success you want to achieve. In terms of an agenda, there are several things that we need to cover. First, we're going to set the stage. In a sense, setting the stage isn't a bad metaphor for what we're doing here, where a cold call is like where 2 characters come together in a one-act play. One is you, and you come to the stage with your products or services and your value proposition, which is basically the reason why somebody should buy them. The other character is the decision maker. She comes to the stage with needs and goals and a decision process and decision criteria that she uses to consider, qualify, and select solutions. You and the prospect interact with a dialogue, and the goal, rather than for you to merely get an appointment, is for the play to have a happy ending for both of you, where you go get your appointment and the decision maker gets her needs fulfilled, and the curtain falls with you two holding hands over the sound of your boss and the prospect's peers applauding your mutual success. In any event, this metaphor suggests that in order to make good cold calls, you need to have a thorough understanding of your offering's value proposition. This is what explains why somebody should buy your company's products or services, or, more relevant for our immediate purposes, why they should want to meet with you. This obviously leads to the question of how decisions are made in business in general, and more specifically, how someone is going to decide to meet with you, an understanding of which is also required for building an effective program and creating an effective script. And so, to set the stage, we also need to talk at a high level about how a cold call, or the play if you prefer, is structured, what the basic ebb and flow of a good cold call looks like, so you can see how you can persuade the prospect to make the decision to meet with you on the basis of your potential value to her and her company. But let's start with the business decision-making process first, because that's pretty straightforward. We'll then look at the high-level view of the cold call, and then we'll finish the prerequisites by building your company's value proposition. As it turns out, there are in fact actually 3 business decisions or business cases that you're asking the prospect to make by cold calling her, or however you reach out. The business case for talking, the business case for meeting, and the business case for buying. For now, we're just going to concern ourselves with the business case for meeting, but they all work in basically the same way, with the amount of time and complexity involved being the bigger challenges. A simple way to look at the decision process that you're facing is to think of it as a balance or a scale. If the reasons to meet outweigh the reasons not to meet, then the decision maker will decide to meet with you. If not, then you won't get the appointment. Or if you like our play analogy, here it is according to William Shakespeare. In any event, as you can imagine, you'd like to find lots of reasons to meet and confront only a few reasons not to meet. And you'd like those reasons to meet to outweigh by a significant margin those reasons not to meet, as you can see here. Now here's the rub, and this isn't just a metaphor or a teaching tool, this is really how it works. Talking with the prospect on the phone, you not only have to come up with reasons to meet that outweigh her reasons not to meet, you may even have to actually quantify those reasons to meet, and you maybe even put a dollar value on them too in order to make them motivational. Importantly though, and not to put too much of a burden on you, unfortunately, all of this is going to have to come from her, not you. That is, it does no good if you say she has a need or a reason to meet you. It actually has to come from her. She has to say she has the need, bears the cost, and cares about solving the problem, not you. You'll learn how to get her to do this, as you'll see, by asking her questions to get her to say what you need her to say and come to the conclusion that you need her to come to. But in building this business case for meeting, she has to identify the needs and put them on the scale, and she, and not only you, has to feel that getting together to consider the solution is worthwhile. In fact, it turns out that in order to generate a good appointment on a cold call or with any tactic, you'll often have to get the prospect to see, if not tell you, exactly how much time or money she could save, how much she can reduce her risk, how much she can increase her sales, how much she can improve their profit margins, or how much more successful the company can be if they consider and ultimately buy your solution. This is because she's going to weigh that against the time and inconvenience of meeting with you, as well as the potential cost of the product, the cost of change, and any risks or conflicts that might come up just as a result of meeting. And if the reasons to meet don't outweigh the reasons not to meet, you're not going to get the appointment. But you can see why getting her to think that it's her idea helps. But this whole business case for meeting thing can be, and in fact is, quite real. The good news, in case you're worried, is that the information that you need to justify the meeting is out there, mostly in her mind. And so you basically just have to get her to admit to things that she already knows. That is, assuming there's a potential application for your product or service, the decision maker will at least have a perception of need, not necessarily or even likely specifically for your product or service, and maybe not even consciously, but in the sense of her being aware of the problems or unmet goals that could, under the right circumstances, justify buying your solution or at least meeting to talk about it. In fact, it turns out what she already knows is a veritable goldmine of justification for meeting if you can dig it out with your questions. That is, Not only does she have needs and problems and goals in her head, but she's aware, even if she doesn't come right out and tell you, that not solving those problems have consequences and costs to her and the stakeholders who depend on her, just as she's aware that solving them has benefits and value both to her and her downstream customers. You just have to be able to dig it out. So while it may be a challenge if she wants to deny it or be difficult, the information is there if you can get to it. Fortunately, as you'll find out, you actually have a major piece of leverage that you can use to counter any denial of need, assuming the need exists, and that is your ability to call and talk to anyone you want. We'll get to how to leverage that in a moment, but first it's important to recognize that just as she has needs and goals, so do her peers. Her internal suppliers, if you will, like the marketing VP who provides her with lists or collateral material, and the product manager who provides her with something to sell, have their own goals and challenges. And at the same time, they also need her to meet her goals and overcome her challenges if they're all to be successful. Likewise, there are people downstream in the process, like internal and external customers for her work, like the product manager who needs her to produce orders that they can fill, or the CFO who needs her to collect AR so he can balance the books, who have their own goals and challenges, but who also depend on her meeting her goals and overcoming her challenges in order for them to be successful. It's all, in a sense, one interconnected network of needs and dependencies, one that, if everyone does their part, of course, leads to the success of the company. But what's important for you when trying to get an appointment or a lead is to recognize their interest in her success as both a source of pressure on her and therefore a source of leverage for you. That is, if your solution can help her solve her problems and meet her goals, then it can also help them solve their problems and meet their goals. She knows it, of course, and now you do too. And so you can ask about it and add their needs to the justification for meeting. Clearly, their needs and goals can and should contribute to the business case for meeting. And just as clearly, asking about them is fair game on the call, just as calling these other decision influencers is fair game in generating the lead, if you have to. This is also because, ultimately, most business decisions are collaborative. That is, rarely is a business decision or even a consumer decision made that doesn't involve the interests or opinions of multiple people or departments, at least indirectly. Your ability to identify those decision influencers and draw in their interests early in the sales process not only helps you generate the lead, but it positions your solution better for sale when the time comes to vote on it. In any event, without going into too much detail for this basic course, let's dive right in and take a look at a simplified version of a prospect's P&L statement, which provides the model for any business case, whether to justify talking, meeting, or buying. As you can see here, the prospect's current P&L on the left shows $1.2 million in revenue and $1.11 in expenses. This throws off $90,000 in gross profit in the current scenario, GP being a principal metric that companies use for measuring success. On the other hand, evidently, if they were to make an investment in your solution of, say, $2,000, as shown on the right, their revenue could potentially go up by $2.58 million to $3.78 million, a very significant increase. And while their expenses look like they'll go up by $1.87 million to $2.9 million, their expense to revenue ratio appears it will go down significantly from 92.5% to 77%, indicating that this initiative is much more profitable than what they're doing now. And so, as you can see, the resulting gross profit would grow to $841,000, a net increase of $751,000 over the $90,000 they're getting today. All in all, if you can get the prospect to see, by asking good questions, that this is the potential benefit of your offering, you should have a pretty strong case for justifying a meeting, and so that's what you're going to try to do. In other words, during the dialogue and the call, you're going to try to understand what their need to grow revenue and decrease expenses at some level relevant to your application. Position your product or service as the solution and get them to see how great things would be after they buy it. To be clear, every company and every product or service should offer some kind of value proposition like this, because if you don't, it's going to be tough to be successful in a competitive market economy where maximizing profits is a major goal of virtually every business. Of course, your benefits may be better expressed in terms of improved quality, efficiency, service, or time savings, at least if you're B2B. But ultimately, your benefits can and should be able to be expressed in some meaningful dollar value that can show up somewhere on the prospect's P&L. Likewise, in B2C, your value should be equally clear, whether it's measured in more fun, more environmentally friendly, easier to use, higher status, or just as good for a lower price. For this reason, we're going to have to spend a bit of time talking about how to illustrate and articulate your value, or more generally, what we call your value proposition, both in the abstract to prepare for a cold call and in the heat of the battle during the call. In this regard, if you can come up with a compelling and interest-worthy value proposition, something that can positively and demonstrably impact the prospect's P&L, then there's a decent chance you're going to be able to get their attention and initial interest to the point where becoming willing to spend a couple of minutes on the phone with you becomes appealing. If that happens, then during that couple of minutes you have on the phone, you try to ask questions that get the prospect to recognize and come to terms with their needs, particularly those that you can solve, and you try to build value in order to get them to see that it's worthwhile to talk further with you about how you can help via a meeting. Finally, you get them to commit to the meeting and to moving the process forward on the basis of their wanting to actually obtain the value that you can provide. But that's the structure or flow of a good call at the 30,000 foot level, and it's no different from how you would want any other marketing effort to work. When we start to drill down a little, we can now start to think of the cold call as a series of steps or decisions as shown in this flow chart. Note that we're going to really get into the weeds here, and we may end up talking for an hour or more about something that might take 5 seconds to do in real life, but that, as I said, is how the sausage is made. Anyway, you first try to get the prospect's attention. If you're using cold call, you try to get them on the phone. If you can't get them on the phone, the process stops. Same with a billboard, same with an email, same with an ad. If you can't get their attention, you've failed. But if you can get their attention, then you try to stimulate their initial interest and engage them in a conversation. If you can stimulate initial interest, then you try to sell them on meeting. If not again, then the process stops. If you can persuade them to meet, then you try to book the appointment. If you can't, then again, the process stops or at least gets deferred. But if you can get them to an appointment, you win. If not, the process drags on forever potentially, and you lose. But those are basically the steps you have to go through in a cold call. Get them on the phone, get them to be willing to talk for a few minutes, convince them to meet, and get them to take some action that actually moves the process forward, exactly like in the AIDA model we talked about before. So now let's look at the specific things you have to do in order to make this happen. As you can see, the first thing you have to do is attempt to connect with the decision maker. This may involve researching a list, and it may involve getting past gatekeepers and voicemail. But if you can't get a decision maker on the phone, then it's going to be pretty hard to convince them to meet, unless maybe one of their gatekeepers manages their calendar, in which case you still have to convince her to do it, and so you still have the same problem. In any event, once you get them on the phone and have their attention, we found that you generally have less than about 15 seconds to stimulate their interest. That is, if you don't say something interesting, relevant, and compelling very early in the call, then most decision makers are going to hang up on you, or at least not take you seriously. Because this is such an important part of the call, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what you can say that's going to work. So even though your call opening might take only 15 seconds to do, it might take days or even weeks of work to put one together that's going to be effective. Anyway, assuming that they haven't already hung up on you, you then have to ask questions which will uncover needs that you might be able to help with and that the prospect wants to solve. Finding problems that you can help with and that the prospect wants to solve is the first key to generating a good lead, but be prepared. You're going to have to ask a lot of good questions in order to do it. If you can't, of course, then the prospect is going to bail out of the call and you'll be left with nothing. So knowing how to ask good questions is important, and it's something else we're going to have to spend a little bit of time on. And finally, as we implied before, it's not good enough just to stimulate interest, uncover some needs, and get the prospect to be willing to meet. You have to get the prospect to actually commit to the appointment and actually attend it with an open and willing mind. So we have to talk about how to close on a firm appointment and prevent the endless delays, no-shows, and postponements that plague so many cold calling campaigns today. To start to understand how to do this, we need to drill down another level deeper and look at what the prospect is thinking during the call so that we can prepare script elements that are going to enable us to engage with them. As you can see here in the little thought bubbles we've added, at each stage of the call, the prospect generally has something in his or her mind or with his or her situation that is influencing the responses and dictating whether or not you're going to make any progress on the call. For example, if the prospect isn't available or you can't find their phone number or email address, it's going to be pretty hard to get their attention and have a conversation. And so you may need to do some homework just to get them on the phone. Once you get them on the phone, you then have to deal with whatever biases and attitudes the prospect normally has whenever they answer a call. For example, we know that when most people answer a phone call, they do so with three questions in mind. Specifically, who are you? What do you want? And once you tell them who you are and what you want, they want to know why they should care. By the way, this is a question that often persists in their mind throughout the call, so we're definitely going to have to figure out how to deal with it. Also, some prospects are just naturally antagonistic towards any call they think is from a salesperson, so whatever we do ought to be designed to take advantage of or deflect that bias. But being prepared to deal with the prospect's initial mindset in your call and in your opening when making your interest-creating remark is crucial to getting to first base. Otherwise, they may hang up on you right away, and as you'll see by the fact that there's no maybe branch coming off the stimulate interest diamond, you may not get another shot at them. The most important things in your prospect's mind that you need to get at and deal with, though, are not their biases, but their needs and problems, challenges, and unmet goals. Now, many of these are going to be hidden, while others may be written right on their performance plan or their to-do list. Some will relate to other people, some may have nothing to do with work, and some are more important than others. But you should understand right up front that they have a lot more needs than you can possibly imagine, which is both good and bad. That is, if you do a good job probing for needs and positioning your product as the solution, then you can end up with a lot of justification for the meeting. The bad news is that it often takes a lot of work to dig them out and create a desire to meet. Anyway, the final set of thoughts that come into the prospect's mind, assuming that you've gotten them to consider their needs, are their decision process and decision criteria. These are important because no matter how good a job you do uncovering needs, if you can't get the prospect to make a decision to act in your favor, specifically to meet, then you're not going to get the appointment. So you have to know how to get the prospect to actually do something and not just string you along. With that as background, we next need to look at what you need to do and how to do it in order to prepare yourself to make good calls, get the prospect on the phone, stimulate interest, uncover needs, and lock down the appointment. As you can see on the left side of the chart now, we've added a few work items. These are the things you need to do in order to enable you to create and implement each corresponding part of the call. That is, there are a bunch of things you need to do before you ever pick up the phone and try to connect with the prospect, like set some goals, get a list, learn about the product, score on the right attitude, and maybe get access to a CRM. There are also some things you need to do in order to come up with an interest-creating remark that won't get you hung up on right away. These are the prerequisites we talked about before, where you work out the proper positioning of your product for the cold call, which we'll also go over. We then have to have a call planner that we're going to take you through to help you write your script elements. This is a process or a model of how to ask the right questions that you can customize so that you can get your prospect to convince herself that she wants to meet with you. And then there's one additional piece you'll have to create in order to ensure that the appointment actually sticks, called concrete steps. The details of these work items constitute the bulk of the presentation that we're talking about today, but don't be discouraged by how complicated it looks. Yes, there's a bit of work to do in order to be able to make good cold calls or develop any marketing program, but it's a little like a moonshot. It takes years of work to have a successful 3-day mission, and it may take several days of work to create an effective 3-minute phone call, but it does work, and it's ultimately a lot easier than failure. So that's our agenda next. Anyway, and hopefully this won't be too confusing, but we're actually going to start not at the beginning of the call, but with writing your interest-creating remark. This is because coming up with something to say that's interesting, relevant, and compelling is one of the hardest things to do when cold calling, particularly early in the call when the prospect is more inclined to hang up on you. The key element of this interest-creating remark is what we call your initial benefit statement, but going through the process of writing it by doing your prerequisites that you see to the left of the red circle enables you to position your product properly, and it puts a lot of other parts of the call in their proper perspective as well. We'll later go back to do the material we're skipping over, but this initial benefit statement and the pieces you have to put together in order to write it are so important to your success on the phones that we need to pull them out now and deal with them right up front. The other reason we do this is because if you're like most cold callers or sales managers who take this course, your biggest problem probably isn't with picking up the phone, and you probably also aren't interested just yet in how to uncover needs or how to get the prospect to commit to the appointment. Rather, it's knowing what to say that won't get you hung up on in the first 15 seconds of the call, or as we like to say, that won't get you a not interested click every time you dial the phone. We understand, of course, that you might see your biggest problem is getting past gatekeepers or overcoming objections or preventing postponements, but experience has shown that many of these problems are actually rooted in the failure to stimulate initial interest. That said, don't worry, we'll talk about how to overcome those challenges as well, if you'll bear with us. Anyway, if you remember from before, we talked about one of the major goals of the cold call being to justify the prospect taking the time to meet with you or with your salesperson if you're making appointments for a field sales rep. And we talked about the prospect weighing in her mind whether it's worth her time to meet with you or not. It turns out, though, that before she can even think about meeting with you, she first has to decide whether or not to even have a 3-minute telephone conversation with you. And that's what stimulating initial interest is all about. In other words, before she can put together a business case for meeting, she first has to put together a business case for talking. Now, admittedly, the prospect is going to put this particular rationale together, such as it is, extremely quickly, maybe in just the first few seconds of the call. But just as they say, first impressions last, and you never get a second chance to make a first impression, you only have a few seconds to make a good first impression on a cold call. And if you don't make a good first impression, then the prospect isn't going to want to hear anything else you have to say. She's just going to hang up on you, or at least not pay much attention to what you have to say. Because this part of the call is so critical, you actually need a formal process for coming up with something compelling, interesting, and relevant to say very early in the call, and you're also going to need a fairly structured opening in which to put it, because you really don't have time to fool around. So let's talk briefly about the mindset of the prospect that we're talking to, what we need to say in order to engage with it, and the script elements in which we want to say it. And then we'll show you how to develop a good business case for talking and preventing the prospect from hanging up on you right away. As you saw before, a prospect, or anyone who's called on the phone for that matter, responds to a ringing phone with 3 main questions in their mind. Immediately upon picking up the phone, assuming that they don't have caller ID or recognize your voice, they want to know who you are. Once you tell them, then they immediately want to know what you want, and once you tell them what you want, they immediately want to know why they should care. This natural thought process suggests that you should use a call opening that explicitly answers these 3 questions so that the prospect isn't distracted by them as you try to build your business case for meeting. Such an opening, therefore, would look like this one on the next slide. As you can see here, there are 5 parts to a good call opening. You first introduce yourself and your company, telling them who you are. You then say something to establish rapport, such as asking them how they are. You then make some interest-creating remark that's specifically designed to stimulate initial interest, and you give the person a reason to care and to stay on the phone. You then explain the purpose of the call, which explains what you want. And then finally, you ask for, either implicitly or explicitly, permission to ask questions so that you can probe for needs and ultimately close on the appointment. So let's go over this in more detail because you need to write your call opening from this model. As you can see, introducing yourself and your company with something like, "Hi, my name is Jeff Josephson from LeadGen.com," is a normal and natural thing to do. It starts to answer the prospect's question regarding who you are. And establishing rapport by asking how they are is the polite thing to do, and it helps remove some of the anxiety that any call recipient has. But now you have a problem. Now you have to tell them what you want, and you have to give them a reason to care, or else the prospect is going to hang up on you. Obviously, you could be brutally, if not foolishly, honest about what you want and say something like, "I want to book an appointment with you," or even, "I'm calling to sell you something." But since the prospect doesn't know any more about you than your name and your company, they're probably going to demur. Or you could lie and tell them you don't want to sell them something, but that could backfire on you later. And so you need to somehow explain a little bit about what you do and give them a reason to care before you lose their attention and they reject your approach. Now, if you're paying attention, you may have noticed that we're actually addressing the "why should I care" question on line 3 before we explicitly tell them what we want, which is in our purpose of the call on line 4, despite the order in which they think it. As it turns out, it's okay to defer answering the "what do you want" question for a moment while you deliver your initial interest-creating remark. This is partly because the prospect has probably already figured out that you're a salesperson anyway, and you probably want to sell them something. And so, in a sense, you've already answered their second question just by introducing yourself. But in most cold calls, that third question, the why should I care question, quickly becomes the most important one anyway, even though less than about 5 seconds of the call have gone by so far. Anyway, we'll explain what we want after we deliver our interest-creating remark when we say our purpose of the call. But it's so important to stimulate initial interest as early as possible that we can just assume that they know we want to sell them something and focus on how to put our best foot forward as quickly as we can. And so it is the interest-creating remark, what we'll call the initial benefit statement, or IBS, that is actually the key to a good call opening. It's the one thing that you get to say on virtually every cold call besides hello and how are you before the prospect decides that the call isn't worth her time and she hangs up on you. So while it's going to take a bit of work to come up with a good IBS, at least you'll always get a chance to say it. As you'll see, a good IBS is the heart of a good opening. It's designed to help define who you are and what you can do for the prospect, to stimulate their interest in what you have to say, and to start to give them a reason to care. And so it has to be, by design, compelling, interesting, and irrelevant. Let's take a look at an example embedded in an introduction so you can see what we're talking about. As you can see, we open the call by introducing ourselves and our company with, "Hi, my name is Jeff Josephson, calling from LeadGen.com." Then we ask how the prospect is doing, which they'll usually answer, and then usually toss the call back to us. Once they give us a chance to talk, we can repeat our name and company for clarity or to make sure she remembers it, but immediately thereafter comes our opportunity to deliver our interest-creating remark, or our IBS. Now, you can think of it as your 5-second commercial or your spiel or your elevator pitch, but the point is that whatever you say at this moment in the call, it has to be something that's very compelling, very interesting, and very relevant to the prospect. Otherwise, they're going to lose interest even if they don't hang up right away. In this example, the IBS that we chose is, "We provide cold calling training that can increase the number of viable sales opportunities you get by a factor of 10 or more for a fraction of the time, effort, aggravation, and cost when compared to traditional or even new internet-based marketing techniques." Obviously, your IBS is going to be written around your particular products or services, but using this one as an example, we can illustrate some of the key elements that go into a good IBS that are going to get your prospect to be excited and interested, and to get them to want to stay on the phone with you. And so to that point, I need to ask you, did this statement get your interest? Was it relevant to a goal or challenge that you have? Is the idea of increasing the number of viable sales opportunities you get by a factor of 10 or more compelling, interesting, and relevant? Obviously, I can't know because we're not in a conversation, but I'll know if it doesn't if my prospect hangs up on me right away. And that's an important point. If one of your goals is to constantly improve your performance, then getting feedback quickly and modifying your approach in response to negative feedback is critical. So if someone hangs up on you as soon as you give your IBS, you need to rewrite it and make it better, potentially over and over again until you get one that works virtually every time. In any event, let's look at some details of a good IBS. As you can see, we spend very little time as possible, as a matter of fact, telling the prospect what we do, which is that we provide cold calling training. That's by design because most people don't actually care what you do, at least not initially. They only care about what it means for them. This is so important that I have to repeat it. Most people don't care what you do. They only care about what you can do for them and how it can help them solve their problems and meet their goals. So don't waste a lot of time talking about what you do in your IBS, or for that matter, later on in the call either. What you should spend the most time talking about when developing your IBS is answering the question, so what? Answering the question of why someone whom you assume, based on your research or experience, to be a qualified prospect should be interested in what you do and what benefits it offers them. In our case, if we assume that we're talking to someone who cares about sales, then talking about how we can help them find more sales faster, cheaper, and more efficiently ought to be compelling, interesting, and relevant. Now, I may be wrong about what's important to the prospect, or I may be wrong about our value, and if so, then I need to fix it. But when writing your IBS, you need to figure out what about your solution would be most compelling, interesting, and relevant to a decision maker, and construct it around that, because that's your best shot at getting their attention and initial interest in the first 15 seconds of the call. To be sure, most people get this part wrong because they focus on features and advantages when they ought to be focusing on benefits. And so how to do this correctly is our next topic. The question of why someone should be interested in talking to you is closely related to the question of why someone should buy from you. And they both revolve around something called your value proposition. Your value proposition is what you bring to the table from the perspective of the prospect. It's not what you do, it's the benefit that someone gains from using your product or service. To understand your value proposition and how to articulate it, we need to talk about how a business, any business, measures and achieves value. As you can see here, this is a simplified version of one of the key financial statements used by a typical business called a profit and loss statement, or P&L. The P&L is basically a report on the profitability of the company, measured in this case in terms of gross profit, or the difference between a company's revenues and their expenses. As you can see, we show the total revenue at the top, and then we've broken down the company's expenses into three categories: cost of goods sold, which you can think of as raw materials; admin expense, which covers things like rent and staff salaries; and sales expense, which covers the salaries, in this case, of their 5 salespeople. As you can see on line 1, our example company had total revenues last year of $1.2 million and expenses on line 6 of $1.1 million, made up of $660,000 in cost of goods sold on line 3, $120,000 in admin expense on line 4, and $330,000 in sales expense on line 5, leaving a gross profit of $90,000 on line 7 as the difference between revenues and expenses. In general, the greater is a company's gross profit, the better, because gross profits funds things like pay raises, dividends, new product development, bonuses for managers, and growth programs, and also support higher valuations if you're selling the company. Therefore, anything that increases revenues or decreases expenses is seen as a good thing by most companies, although there are often other metrics that are also important. But you can now start to get a sense of what most companies value, things that increase revenues or decrease expenses. Along these same lines, a related financial statement that companies also use is called a pro forma P&L. This is just like the profit and loss statement you just saw, except that instead of it being backwards looking at last year, it's kind of a forecast of what they expect to happen next period, although we've included last year's results just to make it easier to see what we're doing. In this case, as you can see, the company is predicting that revenues next year are going to go down a little on line 1 to $1.14 million from 1.2, although we don't know why. At the same time, their total expenses on line 6 are expected to go up by $81,000 to $1.19 million, leaving them with an expected gross profit on line 7 of negative $51,000. That's a loss, mind you, with gross profit being down a rather substantial $141,000 year over year, as you can see. Now, we don't necessarily know why this is happening, other than the fact that their cost of goods sold on line 3 is going up from 55% of revenue to 65% of revenue. But clearly, this company is in a little trouble, especially with their revenues expecting to take a bit of a hit, too. Anyway, companies create these forecasts for a lot of reasons, and while we don't necessarily know why their expenses are expected to go up or their sales are expected to go down, knowing that it's going to happen in advance at least gives them some time to do something about it and maybe prevent the problem. In any event, companies can easily use this format to support making a wide variety of decisions. For example, as we saw before, if the company doesn't do anything about this pending increase in expenses and their pending revenue decline, then they're going to end up losing $51,000 next year. Not a good thing. On the other hand, it looks like someone has presented a proposal in the do something column. While it evidently requires an investment of $2,000 on line 7, and it also seems to bump up sales expense on line 5 from $330,000 to $360,000, it looks like it will increase revenues from $1.41 million to $3.78 million on line 1. Given the small size of this investment, this seems like it would be a good idea despite the increase in sales expense, taking them from a forecasted loss of $51,000 to a forecasted profit of $841,000, a significant swing to the positive. There are 3 things you need to note here. First is that there's something called a business case that can be used to compare the merits of one or more strategies. And that's an important concept for you to understand, this business case, because your proposal, whether it's a proposal to meet or a proposal to buy, will ultimately be judged in a format just like this. That is, if you're proposing to sell them something or even meet, they're going to look at it as an investment, whether of time or money. If that investment can be anticipated to cause other numbers on their P&L to move in the right direction, they're probably going to like it. If it doesn't, or if they can't see how it might move the numbers in the right direction, they won't like it, and you won't get the appointment or the sale. We're going to come back later in the course and talk about how to get them to see your benefit and how you can move the numbers in the right direction. But for now, just embed it in your thinking that that's what you have to be able to do. That's the picture you have to paint in your mind of the prospect if you want to be consistently successful on the phones or in sales. Anyway, second point is that in general, anything that promises to increase gross profit will usually be seen as positive and valuable to most companies, while anything that reduces gross profit will be viewed as a negative. And therefore, at a high level, your value proposition, as you'll see, is simply the degree to which it can increase gross profit. Obviously, there are multitudes of complicating factors. For example, companies regularly deal with dozens, if not hundreds, of decisions like these all the time. The level of detail underlying even the simplest cost reduction or revenue enhancement initiative can be mind-boggling. And although not everything can be directly measured in dollars, the value of most things, such as saving time, enhancing customer service, improving quality, and reducing risk, can easily be translated into dollars if you take just a few moments. But no matter how complex or obtuse it gets, what companies value is almost always to be able to be expressed in some form of the business case like this, with the measure of the value of a proposal or initiative being the degree to which it increases gross profit. But the third thing to note here is the most important, and that is that every one of these numbers at every level of detail that you care to look at is the responsibility of someone or some group in the organization. That is, there is someone, at least one person, and often many, who are responsible for generating revenue. There are people responsible for spending and saving money, and there are people responsible for managing assets, allocating resources, and using them to accomplish the company's objectives up and down the corporate hierarchy, no matter how large or how small the business. In fact, it turns out, in most cases, these people will actually have specific objectives for revenue, expenses, quality, output, risk, compliance, time management, speed to market, productivity, or any of 100 different metrics that eventually translate into lines on the P&L. That's what they're being paid to do. The reason we mention this, of course, is because not only can your value proposition, if it's articulated correctly, link to the company's P&L, it can also link directly to an objective on someone's performance plan, and that gives you a reason to talk to them about it. In fact, if you can help them better achieve their performance objective, that's what gives them a reason to talk to you about it. So now, for example, let's say we're trying to get an appointment with the VP of Sales for our cold calling training course on the basis of its ability to help her sales team generate more sales leads and thereby increase their revenues and maybe their profitability too. Theoretically, if they were able to generate more and better quality sales leads as a result of our training, they should be able to do better against their sales objective, which is typically something they're measured on. And if there's anyone in the company concerned with gross profit, that person might be interested too. So in order to try to illustrate this, let's take a look at some of the work we did for another previous client as shown in this spreadsheet and see if it suggests how we can potentially be of value to the new sales VP and her team. You, of course, should do the same type of exercise, developing one or more spreadsheet models that show your decision makers the increase in gross profit and any other metrics that they could expect by using your solutions based on the experience of previous customers you've served. But let's continue with the example. Let's say that we had previously worked with a company that had 4 sales reps on line 1 who historically generated an average of 3 new appointments per week per rep on line 2 using their old approach, but which with our training doubled to an average of 6 new appointments per week per rep. This translates to an increase for the company from 48 leads per month to 96 leads per month, as you can see on line 3, or double what they were doing before. Let's also say that our sales training also enabled these sales reps to increase their close rate from 15% to 25%, shown on line 4, a pretty nice but not unexpected improvement of 66% due to the sales training. And let's say this enabled them to increase their closed sales on line 5 from around 7.2 to 24 closes per month, an increase of over 300%. And they also, because of their newly improved sales skills, were able to increase their average revenue per sale by 10% from an average of $5,000 per sale to an average of $5,500 per sale, as shown on line 6. As a result of these improvements in sales performance, as you can see, revenue per month went from $36,000 to $132,000, shown on line 7, an increase in sales of 366%, something that we think most businesses would find to be extremely appealing. But of course, as you know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The training cost them something. In this case, $1,000, shown as an expense on line 8. And field sales expense went up on line 9 from $2,400 to $4,800 because they basically had more appointments to go out on. Although most companies would find that to be a small price to pay for the increase in gross profit that it led to on line 10 of $96,600, a spectacular 375% increase shown on line 11. Clearly, this investment of $1,000 in sales training was a very good one for this particular company. So while they say in investing, past performance is no indicator of future performance, if somebody could double the number of leads they can get, enable you to increase your close rate by 66%, and bump your average revenue per sale by 10%, a $1,000 investment might seem like a no-brainer. And so it seems reasonable that that's what we should be talking about. When talking to a new prospect about what we might be able to do for them, whether it's in our IBS or as an example later in the call, clearly we should be talking about how we can double the number of appointments their sales reps get. We should be talking about how we can help them increase their close rate by 2/3 and how we can help them increase their average revenue per sale. And we should be talking about how we can have a major positive impact on their bottom line at a vanishingly low cost. And you should be doing the same thing for your offerings. Equally important, though, is what this says about the perspective you should be taking. This is because hopefully you can see that we're not selling training here. Hopefully you can see that we're selling a nearly 4-fold increase in revenue, a doubling in sales productivity and performance, and a spectacularly profitable use of $1,000. And that, and not our features, and not even our training, is our value proposition and the benefit of our solution. We're selling a 4-fold increase in sales performance, not sales training. Now let me ask you, should our hypothetical new decision maker care about this? Is she responsible for revenue production, sales, new business, or ROI? Of course she is, and so therefore we ought to be able to stimulate her interest, at least initially, if we talk about these kinds of benefits in our IBS by holding out the possibility that a 3-minute conversation might reveal how she might be able to accomplish equally high levels of performance too. Clearly, I could be wrong about her objectives, and she may not even have a problem meeting them. But this is, without a doubt, the best shot we have based on the information we have at the moment, and so it should make a good IBS. And so you too should develop one or more models like this, models that show not only the performance improvement that you can enable, but how that translates into dollars right down to the bottom line as your best way for stimulating initial demand. In other words, just in case it's not clear, the most important lesson of this example is to show you that you're not selling sales training, copiers, software development, insurance, widgets, or whatever you show on your line card. You're selling the benefit that someone gains by buying it, the revenue increase or the savings, for example, that a prospect would get as the result of using your product. Consequently, when you're trying to come up with something interesting, compelling, and relevant to say about your product or service, especially early in the call, what you therefore need to be talking about is the measurable benefit that its use can have on the prospect, particularly in the areas of increasing revenues and reducing cost, but at least in some measurable terms that are going to be meaningful for the prospect. For most companies, the only way to do that is to put together a spreadsheet like this that shows the bottom line impact of your benefits, and we're going to show you exactly how to do it shortly. Going back to our IBS now, you can see why you don't want to talk about your features or advantages, and you can see why nobody cares who you are, who else you've sold to, whether you're a leading vendor, a member of the same Chamber of Commerce, or how long you've been in business. The only thing that matters, the only thing you should be talking about, especially early in the call, is what your product or service can do for someone who uses it, as you can see in these additional examples on the next slide. So here are some additional IBSs that should get someone's attention and initial interest. We provide lead generation solutions that can double your sales in a matter of weeks at half the cost of your current method. We provide email marketing that can halve your telemarketing costs while simultaneously shortening your sales cycle by 50% or more. And we provide competitive marketing strategies that can enable you to beat your competition at a higher price, leading to higher market share, fewer competitive losses, and stronger profit margins. Clearly, if you can make statements like these about your solutions very early in the phone call, you're going to stimulate initial interest, assuming you're talking to the right person, and you're therefore going to get a shot at having a conversation and generating the lead. We'll talk in a moment about how best to come up with ways of describing your value in more IBSs, but first we need to take a little side trip to talk about some marketing theory. but start thinking about your value, not your features. When we talk about what constitutes a good sales lead, most salespeople tell us that a good sales lead is an appointment with a decision maker who has a need for his products or services and who wants to talk with them about how he can help. These are represented by the three corners of this chart. A prospect who wants to talk with you about a need or a problem for which you have a solution. Now, as you saw a moment ago, the fact of the matter is that no one ever really needs a particular product or service, just as no one needs sales training or copiers or software development or insurance or widgets. Rather, at least in our case, they simply need to increase their sales, and sales training is a way to solve that problem. Likewise, if you're selling copiers, you know that your customers really don't need this big electronics-filled box. They need to improve their information flow or documentation. Or if you're selling insurance, you understand that they don't need the piece of paper, they need peace of mind. So an important first step is being able to put together a good IBS, which is our goal here, is to be able to differentiate between the needs, pains, and problems and unmet goals that drive people to buy your product and the product itself. Only then can you begin to understand your value. The classic case of this, of course, is the electric drill. That is, no one actually needs a drill. What they need is a hole. A drill is simply one way to make one. And in fact, you conceivably could use a laser or a bullet or an oil or a milling machine and make one. But the need or problem is the hole, or more accurately, depending on what you're trying to build, what you need is a place to put a bolt or sink a screw without splitting the wood. And so that brings us to the key concept, that of an application or the use of a technology to solve a particular problem. You can see this on the diagram as the double-headed arrow connecting the solution and the needs. But to be absolutely clear, while it may seem to be esoteric and off-topic, understanding your applications is crucial to understanding your value and coming up with a good opening, as we're about to explain. So let's now continue with the analogy of the drill. In the case of the drill, the application is, say, building a piece of furniture. That is what you as the user ultimately want. What has value to you is the result of using the product to solve the problem, as shown in the next slide. In the case of the drill, value is derived by using the drill to avoid splitting the wood in order to build a piece of furniture so that you can have a place to sit. Clearly, this process can get a little recursive. For example, you may need a place to sit so you can have friends over to watch TV, so you can enjoy a football game together, so you can bet on the game, and so on. But this is how the prospect sees the opportunity, or any initiative or proposal, as a series of so whats until they get to something that they value. In the case of our sales training, the application may be increasing sales or improving sales efficiency or increasing close rates. Or in the case of copiers, the application might be improving information flow or preserving records or being able to give someone a piece of information. Or in the case of insurance, it might be offsetting financial risk so they can do some other function. But if you understand the concept of value being derived from using the product, then the next step should make sense. That is, if the use of your product has value to your customer, then that value can be quantified, and therefore it can represent the value of your solution or your value proposition, which brings us full circle back to our IBS. So, for example, let's look at our cold calling training. What is cold calling training worth to you? If you're like most students, it's worth the increase in revenues that you can get from using the technique minus the cost of learning it. Or it might be worth the reduction in aggravation or rejection and their concomitant productivity impact. Or it might be worth the improvement in close rate from having better qualified sales leads and the consequent increase in price, margin, and market share that you can expect, all of which can be easily quantified and translated into dollars. Clearly, as you can see, the value is in the eye of the beholder, and it's clearly not in the product. What you need to do, therefore, is figure out what problems customers can solve by using your products and what the ultimate measurable value is to them of solving those problems. You could then easily be able to come up with your own value propositions. It takes a few steps, and so that's what we're going to talk about how to do next. So now let's take a second and go back to our high-level view of the cold call and remind us of where we are so you don't think we've gotten off track. Where we are is here, trying to come up with an interest-creating remark, which we now know is called your IBS, or initial benefit statement. We now know that it needs to clearly express your value proposition and that it needs to be designed and written so that it can effectively stimulate initial interest on the part of the prospect so she won't hang up on you after the first thing that comes out of your mouth. Now, if we enlarge the piece that's been circled, you get what we refer to as your prerequisites, the things you have to do in order to build a good interest-creating remark, in all its measurable glory as shown on the next slide. There are several steps that most people have to go through in order to come up with a good value proposition, which is the core of a good IBS. And while it may seem like a lot of work to do, it's actually pretty straightforward and maybe even easy. And for many companies, the exercise is quite enlightening. If you already have these pieces, then you shouldn't need to recreate them, but most companies don't have them, so you may have to create them in order to write a good IBS. These are, to be clear though, living documents. You may need to edit them if you need to come up with more, better, newer, or stronger IBSs, which is often done in response to changing market conditions or resistance from the market. And if you decide to target new markets or needs, they can be invaluable foundations on which to build a new strategy. Regardless, what follows is a simple analytic process that most companies can go through in order to come up with a good marketing proposition, and most cold callers can go through in order to come up with something compelling to say at the beginning of a call. As you can see, you start by writing a few case histories. These describe ways in which previous customers have used your products or services to solve needs and problems and derive benefits in the past. You then extract those problems and needs from your case histories in order to isolate them, elaborate on them, and fully define them. And while you may find that this so-called needs analysis makes an excellent training document for your salespeople, its main purpose is to help you focus on customer needs rather than on your products in both the development of your value proposition and in preparing for your cold calling activity. Once you understand your customer needs, you can then define your product's applications or the uses that customers make of your products in order to solve their needs and problems, which in turn enables you to understand and quantify the value of your solutions. And then finally, you need to represent that value mathematically and in dollars, usually in the form of a spreadsheet model, so that you can talk to your prospects about it and enable them to build a business case for talking, meeting, or buying. So let's get started. As you may know, case histories are brief, usually one-page stories about customers who used your products or services in the past to solve some problems and gain some benefits. But our format may be a little different from what you're used to. For our purposes, you don't need to name names, and you don't need quotes. In fact, if you're a new company or you have a new product that no one's used before, you don't even need real situations. You can just make up scenarios. But the key is that the focus needs to be on the user and their problems, not on you or your product. For example, many companies publish case histories where satisfied customers gush about the product, the vendor, or the service or the results. In developing case histories for marketing in general and for cold calling in particular, this approach is completely useless. This is because prospects have needs and problems and they can't see past them. So to focus on how great life will be after the problems are solved is meaningless to them. Similarly, to focus on how somebody else made out because of your product is equally off-putting. Instead, case histories need to focus on the problems and the challenge of solving them, something that most prospects will be able to relate to. As far as format is concerned, you can make them pretty for distribution, but usually they're in the form of a basic 6-paragraph essay. In the first paragraph, you describe the customer. You may describe their industry, their size, or their region, but what you mostly want to do is explain what the customer's objective was and what they were trying to accomplish. You then need to describe their problem. What was preventing them from achieving their goal? What were their barriers to success? You should then talk about the consequences of the problem. If they couldn't solve it, what would happen? What was it costing them? Who else did it affect? And what was it costing them too? If you want, you can have an optional paragraph that talks about what they initially did to try and solve the problem, but it didn't work. But you can then talk briefly about how you and the prospect found each other and very briefly describe what you did to solve the problem. But note, the less you say about what you did, the better. Next, you need a paragraph that describes the outcome for the customer. That is, what happened as a result of their using the product. What impact did it have on their performance metrics? And finally, you need a paragraph that describes the benefit of solving the problem for the customer, their employees, or even their customers. The more benefits and the more you can quantify them, especially in dollars, the better. But that's the format. It's like a bedtime story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with setting, drama, and conflict, followed by resolution and redemption. There's a company with a problem. It's bad. They tried something that didn't work, so they called you. You solved it, and everyone lived happily ever after. For example, we had a client, a trucking firm, who had built a refrigerated warehouse to store frozen foods to be delivered to retail supermarkets in the area. But they didn't have enough business to make it profitable, and they were at risk of not being able to make their loan payments. They tried pitching to the logistics managers at their traditional food manufacturer customers, but their prices were too high, and so no one bit. At risk of having to shut down the operation because of high electric costs, they called us for help. Realizing that they were targeting the wrong people at the wrong companies with the wrong messages, we put together a pilot program to go after what we thought was a better market with a better message. Within a month, we had gotten them into a half a dozen large food manufacturers, and within another 2 weeks, they had closed their first new account for their refrigerated services. And within 2 years, they had become the largest refrigerated trucking company in the region, covering their debt service and consistently running more than 80% of capacity. So the question is that a good story? Does that begin to describe what we do? Does it begin to help someone understand our value? Of course it does. Notice, by the way, that nowhere did we ever mention what we actually did, and yet it is compelling and it ought to make an excellent reference. Let's look at another one. In another case, a local health benefits broker was having trouble reaching its growth targets. They were in a highly competitive market, but they couldn't compete on price because the rates were set by the carriers. When they tried to emphasize their higher service levels, they couldn't get their message through the clutter in the media. Prospects sometimes shop brokers before renewal, so the client could occasionally get a shot at the business, but everyone seemed to be happy with their current broker, so no one ever changed. As a result, their salespeople either bought the business by playing golf or they starved. They came to us as a result of a direct mail piece we sent out. We quickly put together a telemarketing program that focused on their service advantages, and within 2 months, the program was producing 20 to 30 new qualified sales appointments per month. By refocusing their sales pitch on the dollars that they could save their customers with better service, they quickly increased their close rate to 50%, nearly 3 times what it was. And within 3 years, they had become the second leading broker in the region, with the owners eventually being able to sell the company for a substantial multiple. Again, is this a good bedtime story? Would a prospect for our services find the message about a company with a marketing problem that was eventually solved to be relevant, interesting, and compelling? Maybe. Certainly some would. Does anyone really care how we did it? Obviously, at some point in the sales cycle, the prospect is going to want to know how we solved the problem. But our goal for right now is to stimulate initial interest, and so how we solve the problem is irrelevant. We can only stimulate initial interest if we can get the prospect to relate to our customer by virtue of them having a similar problem and seeing us as helpful in fixing it. How about another story? In this case, a large network equipment manufacturer who had 40 bars who were supposed to be pitching their products simply couldn't get them to go after new accounts. The bars were happy to milk their bases. After all, they were fat, dumb, and happy working off the manufacturer's advertising, so why knock on doors? After the manufacturer found us on the web, we put together a research and lead generation program that eventually put 60 or more qualified leads per month in the hands of the VARs, some worth tens of millions of dollars. As a result of the program, the company was not only able to generate tens of millions of dollars in new sales, but they were able to motivate their VARs to follow up, pulling through many additional market share points and significantly added profit for both parties. Again, does this story help you to understand what we do or how we do it? Probably not. But who cares? It helps you understand our value, and that's what matters. In the front end of the sales process, when generating leads, no one cares that we provide telemarketing services or marketing consulting or sales training. They only care about their own needs, problems, and goals. So hearing a story about someone else who had those same needs, problems, and goals is going to be a lot more meaningful and attention-getting than talking about what we do and how we do it. Not surprisingly, if you think about it, the fact is that people simply can't make the inference that they need your product just by you telling them that you offer it. You have to be talking about the needs and problems that motivate someone to buy in order to connect. Clearly, we need to say something about what we do at some point, but the focus of the pitch, initially at least, is on the needs and the benefits of solving them. So do we make phone calls, or do we help channel programs be successful? Do we write letters, or do we help companies turn around a failing operation? Do we provide sales training, or do we help companies increase their funnel, their close rate, their prices, and their market share? And so finally, let's talk about a small IT company that called us because they couldn't get any traction in the market. They had some great solutions, but no one ever responded to their advertising, their trade show booth, or even their own cold calls. As a division of a larger company, they could withstand losing money, but they certainly weren't popular around the office. And at some point, the operation was at risk of being shut down if they couldn't stand on their own 2 feet. Responding to one of our telemarketing initiatives, they explained to us their different offerings and some of the problems they were having getting in the door. And we realized that their biggest problem was that they were trying to be all things to all people. So we focused them on one solution for one market, and by the end of the pilot program, they had landed their first new account. Ramping up, they soon were getting a dozen new opportunities a month with a 25% close rate that bumped their sales by 400% in the first year and turned them from a cost center to a profit center. So again, does anyone really care that we do market analysis? Does anyone really want our telephone skills? Of course not. What customers want is our ability to help them grow. And so by now, you should not only be getting a sense of our value, but you should be able to start thinking about your value as well. Not in terms of your products, but in terms of your applications and your benefits. Before we show you exactly how to do that, let's just summarize the case history process since, as you can see, not only do they help you understand your value proposition, they also make great sales aids. In short, the process of defining your value proposition and writing a good script starts with writing a batch of case histories that describe your customer's problems, your solution briefly, and the benefits that your customers gained by working with you. Remember that the focus should be on the customer's challenges and what they did and what they gained as a result of your having helped address them. It's not about your solution. Remember, a good bedtime story is all about a girl with dreams, an evil stepmother, a glass slipper, and riding off into the sunset with Prince Charming. It's not about the ball decorations. It's about 3 pigs and a wolf, not the guy who sold them the bricks after the straw and the sticks didn't work out. So now your assignment is to write 3 to 5 case histories using the format that you see here. More is better, but when you're done, you can continue with the presentation. If you want to send them to us to review and you've subscribed to the service, feel free. Once you've written a few case histories, if you've done them right, then extracting your customer needs in a needs analysis, which is the next step, is generally a matter of expounding on the problems that your customers had in your case histories and elsewhere. If you're a new company or have a new product, simply imagine what they are within the stories you made up. The key here is to write a paragraph or 2 describing each need or problem. Take them out of the context of your solution and talk about them only in terms that a customer would understand. This is important since 2 of the things you want to articulate are the costs and consequences of the problem, and they have nothing to do with your solution. Try to find 3 to 5 needs in each story, and overall try to identify at least a dozen for the products or services you're promoting. Just remember, your company doesn't exist to make or sell a product. Your company exists to solve problems. Therefore, you have to know what those problems are, and this is the fastest and easiest way to identify them. Again, where are we? You're working on your prerequisites for articulating your value proposition, and in this step, you need to analyze your customer's needs. Or if this diagram works better for you, you're defining the needs and problems that underlie a good lead. So here are some examples of needs from the case histories we just discussed. Understanding that this is just the tip of the iceberg. When you do this for your own company, go as deep as possible and define as many needs as possible. This is because understanding your customer needs not only helps you articulate your value proposition, it enables you to recognize them better on a cold call, which is very important, as you'll see later. That is, and to give you a little heads up, when you make a cold call, remember that your job is not to present your solution. It's to uncover needs for your solution. Therefore, you have to know what needs to look for. And this process enables you to do it. In fact, to skip this step can doom a cold calling program, or any marketing program for that matter, because otherwise the call is just a show and tell. In any event, here's a need from our first case history, the one where the trucking company built a refrigerated warehouse and they didn't have enough revenue to cover their debt service. Is having insufficient sales to cover costs a common problem that we can help solve? Of course it is. Any company that's losing money has exactly that problem, so write it out. Another example of a need or problem that our customers have is that companies sometimes have partners who don't pull their weight. Describing the problem in all its gory detail is both fun and productive. The more you can understand the problem, the more likely will you and your prospect be able to relate to one another. Is that important? Of course it is. But of course, where we really want to go with this still lies ahead. So here's another example of a customer need. In this case, we have customers who have ineffective marketing programs. They spend thousands of dollars, if not more, on promotional programs that simply don't work. These programs take time and they look important, but ultimately they don't deliver viable opportunities to their salespeople. As a result, the salespeople end up with too much quota left over at the end of the year. They miss the market, and sometimes the company goes out of business. Is that an important need? As a cold caller for a company that wants to sell a solution, shouldn't I be sensitized to look for it? Of course I should. So why don't companies write this stuff down? We don't know, but you should do it for your solutions so that you know what to look for on a cold call. Anyway, once you've identified your customer needs, make sure that you detail the consequences. For example, who cares that they don't have enough sales? Who does that affect? What does it cost them to have unproductive VARs? Who else is hurt? And what additional problems does that cause? Dig in, wallow in it, and have fun. The more needs you can list and the uglier you can make them, the better. It's like for want of a nail, the battle was lost. Dig in, pile on, make it seem like not getting your help is the end of the world, because frankly, sometimes it is. Do this for your own company, for your own products and services. Don't just assume that everyone understands the needs that justify your solution. In most cases, frankly, they don't. In fact, often the only ones who understand the underlying needs are your product development people because they have to design the solution. Just remember, you're not selling features, you're selling benefits. So you need to understand your customer needs, the satisfaction of which creates the benefit. If you're having trouble understanding it, think about it this way. Talking about features actually unsells your solution. This is because talking about your product or its features lets the prospect say, I don't need that. On the other hand, talking about needs forces the prospect to admit that she has them if she does, which enables you to eventually offer a solution. Likewise, talking about benefits forces the prospect to say, I want that benefit, which gives her a reason to be interested. Here's another way to look at it. The more features you talk about, the more that competitors will beat down your price. They do this by adding more features at the same price in order to seem like a better value. On the other hand, the more benefits a product has, the higher will be the price that you can get. After all, what's a diamond ring but a loop of metal with a rock on it? Obviously, it has some benefits and value that are completely unrelated to its features, but which somehow justify an outsized willingness to pay. Whatever the reason, though, it's clearly all in the mind of the customer, not in the product, a point we'll elaborate on in a moment. But focus on your customer needs, not on your features, by writing them down. When you analyze your customer needs, really elaborate on them, study them, and then during the call you can probe for them. And later when you get to the appointment, because you uncovered a few, be sure to describe them in the lead write-up because the salesperson can then sell to them. In any event, if you want to send us what you've written, feel free. We'd be glad to tell you if you're on the right track or not. Okay, so now that you have a good understanding of your customers' needs, you can start thinking about how they can use your products or services to solve specific problems. And that's the purpose of application analysis. The reason we do this is because we need to understand our value in terms that the prospect will understand it, so we can show it on the P&L we talked about earlier. And you can only do that by actually measuring the value of the product in use. Again, to help orient you, here's where we are. As you can see, you're working towards defining your value proposition, the key to writing a good initial benefit statement. What you've done so far is simply to understand the needs for your products based on your having written a few case histories and added whatever additional needs you can think of. You now need to understand how people are going to use your products to satisfy those needs, not in a case history format specific to one customer, but more generally. So let's start with the definition of an application. As you can see here, an application is the use of a product or service to solve a particular problem. Go back to the previous slide if you want to see it graphically. But basically, an application defines the relationship between your product and the needs it satisfies. In other words, it defines the use of your product. For example, using a drill to make a pilot hole is an application of a drill. Using it to drive in a screw is another application of a drill, as is polishing brass, stirring paint, pumping water, installing a new doorknob, and routing a septic line to clean out a clog. Notice that, not coincidentally, many of these start with the ing clause, but all of them are uses or applications of a drill. just as learning how to generate more sales leads or learning how to qualify sales leads better or enhancing Salesforce efficiency or getting more people to attend your webinars or shortening your sales cycle or increasing your close rate are all good applications of cold calling training. So where are we going with all this? As we said, it's ultimately not your product or service that has value in the mind of the customer or in the transaction. Rather, it is the application that holds the value. That is, when a customer thinks of value, in fact, especially when they think about how much they'd be willing to pay for a product or when they're deciding whether or not they want to meet in order to talk with you about it or not, they usually don't think about the product at all. They usually think about what they can do with it, unless, of course, you distract them by talking about features. Applications are what they associate value with, not the product. And that's why we need to talk about applications or the uses of your product to solve a specific problem or need. So again, let's say you're selling a drill. To be clear, it's the drill's ability to make a pilot hole, drive in a screw, shine brass, pump water, and clear a clogged sewer line that the customer's paying for, not the drill itself. Or in the case of cold calling training, it's the ability of the training to help you generate more and better sales leads, qualify leads faster, get more people to attend a webinar, shorten your sales cycle, or increase your close rate that you're paying for when you purchase this course, not its entertainment value. This is one of the reasons why prospects don't only compare your product to its direct competitors. They also compare it to substitute products or services. In the case of a drill, it's why people sometimes buy milling machines or polishers or sump pumps instead of drills, or why they call a plumber or roto-rooter instead of doing it themselves. For us, it's why companies sometimes outsource their cold calling or hire someone with experience or switch to SEO, email marketing, or advertising instead of learning how to make better cold calls themselves. The point is that it's not the product that the value is associated with. It's the application that holds the value. It's what you can do with the product that's worth paying for or meeting to talk about. That's why we focus on it and build our opening around it. For convenience sake, you might want to think, as we said, of applications as often ending in ing. In fact, applications in general are verbs, not nouns. They're actions, not things. Actions like growing sales, saving money, improving productivity or efficiency, building a new sales force, reducing onboarding time, improving quality, defeating competition, speeding information flow, or doing things faster, better, or cheaper are all examples of applications and that illustrate the concept. Or if you're compelled to mention the product, using telemarketing to grow sales, implementing an LMS to shorten onboarding time, buying a piece of capital equipment to reduce production costs, sending emails to increase awareness, implementing an SEO program to improve page rank, using a drill to make a pilot hole, and so on. All are applications that one can define and that all have value. As you can hopefully see, as a result of using this approach, you can now start to think about creating a business case for meeting, one that will ultimately be based on the potential ROI the prospect expects they could get from using the product, not from the product itself. For now, though, write out what you think are the major applications of your products or services. Think in terms of how customers are going to use your products or services and what they're going to do with them, and give it a name because naming things makes them real. A helpful technique for this, by the way, is brainstorming. This is because it's sometimes hard for one person working alone to come up with a list of applications. But with a few people looking at it, you can often come up with some brilliant insights as to how people use your products or could use your products. For example, in the case of cold calling training, you might be taking this course in order to be able to generate more and better sales leads. But you could also use it to learn how to nurture old accounts, expand your network of contacts, implement a market research program to uncover new product ideas, drive traffic to your website, spread rumors about a competitor. Not that we would endorse that, of course. Fill a webinar or announce a new product. Make a list of the uses or applications of your own products and services. Name them and write a paragraph on each, because next you're going to put a dollar value on it. Here, if we assume we're selling a training course on how to make good cold calls, there are a few examples of what someone could do with it. Someone might purchase this course in order to be able to generate more and better sales leads. You might be a sales manager who wants to improve the efficiency of your salespeople who have to make their own appointments so they can make quota before they run out of time. You might have bought it because you want to increase your close rate or shorten your sales cycle or increase your market share, your prices, or your profitability. Do the same thing for your applications. Get to know them and start thinking about how using your product or service improves them. Okay. So now that you have a good description of your applications, you can now begin to understand your value in terms that are meaningful to your customers and prospects. To do this, you need to quantify the improvements in the business or its metrics that using your solution can deliver. Or if you feel more comfortable with this construct, we're going to calculate your value from the prospect's perspective. As you can see on this table, if you write your applications in the left column and you define them reasonably well, you can easily come up with a measure of the value of your solution by looking at the performance metrics that can be improved by using it. Of course, this may be easier for some companies to do than others, and if you can't come up with a customer's performance metric that can be improved by your product, then you may want to rethink what you're doing, because that's the key to finding your value. But let's take a minute and look at a couple of examples. When you're talking about applications, whether it's using cold calling training to generate sales leads, using a copier to improve information flow, or drilling holes to make furniture, because you're talking about doing something, there's always a question of doing it better or doing it worse, of doing it one way now and doing it differently and hopefully better as measured by some delta or change in performance with your solution. For example, let's take a solution like cold calling training that's designed to enable a sales team to generate more and better sales leads, improve sales force efficiency, and improve their competitiveness. That one's easy. Let's say a prospect's current approach enables them to generate 8 leads per month. The new approach, after they've had their training, enables them to generate 60 leads a month. All other things being equal, the new approach is better than the old one, in this case improving appointment production by more than 700%. Likewise, we can measure a reduction in cost per lead, where the current cost is $400 an appointment, but after taking our cold calling training program, experience suggests that it might expect their cost per lead to go down to $200, a 50% reduction. Or we can look at how using your training, that is not the training itself, but how using the training can improve sales force efficiency and effectiveness, increasing their close rate from 10% to 25%, bumping the percent of reps who exceed quota from 60% to 85%, and cutting their sales cycle in half from 6 months to 3. As statements of value proposition, hopefully you'll see these as compelling, interesting, and relevant to a qualified prospect. And that's precisely the point. That's what you want the prospect to see for your solutions too. By the way, do you see how this relates to the P&L spreadsheet we looked at before? If not, we're going to make it crystal clear soon. But first, let's say you're selling a solution such as a system designed to improve information flow, where the metrics may not be so clear. You could count, however, the number of people who see and read a piece of information before and after the solution was implemented as a demonstration of the improvement. You could test people on the content and compare the results before and after. And if there was a measurable improvement, all other things being equal, the new approach is better. Or you could look at job performance or cycle time for projects, improvements in any of which could be a clear demonstration of the value of your solution. And asserting on a cold call that you can deliver these kinds of improvements should help get a prospect's attention and initial interest, and justify at least a brief conversation, which is precisely what you're trying to do. Even with something like using a drill to build a piece of furniture, it's relatively easy to demonstrate value, provided you look at it from the customer's perspective, like this. For example, you can measure waste reduction from fewer pieces of wood being split. You can measure improved customer satisfaction or fewer returns if it's a commercial operation. Or you could look at rework splinters or the time it takes for sanding. And if they're less, fewer, and faster, then using the drill has value that can be measured, all other things being equal. As you can see, for any solution that improves a business process, you should be able to measure that improvement or delta, and that improvement then becomes the subject of your IBS, while the delta becomes your value. So now, if you take these potential performance improvements and put them in sentence format, you get what we hope will be some pretty powerful IBSs, like these for the cold calling training example. We provide cold calling training that can enable your sales team to generate 7 times as many appointments. We provide cold calling training that can reduce your cost per lead by 50% or more. And we provide cold calling training that can triple your qualification rate and close rate, cut your sales cycle in half, and increase the number of reps who make quota by 33%. Would these statements be compelling, interesting, and relevant to someone who cares about sales results? Would they help get the attention of someone who might be a good candidate for buying cold calling training? Of course they would. In fact, if it's not interesting to them, then they're probably not a good prospect for us. And so, would equivalent statements based on the measurable improvements in performance that your products can enable be compelling, interesting, and relevant to your prospects? Of course they would. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a good prospect. By the way, That's another reason why we do this. That is, we don't only want to convince someone who should buy our product to meet with us, we also want to avoid wasting time with someone who can't or won't buy. Sure, if a value proposition this strong can't stimulate their interest, we might have to rewrite it, but they also might not be a good prospect. By the same token, we also, if we don't happen to be talking to the right person, ought to be able to motivate someone who doesn't have these particular items on their performance plan to give us a referral to someone who does, and that's another benefit of this approach. In any event, just so you don't think this applies only to cold calling training, here are a few more IBSs for other products or services we talked about, maybe like yours. For example, we provide content distribution systems that can enhance information flow, quadruple readership, boost comprehension by 30%, improve job performance, and reduce project cycle time by 25% or more. Or we make a drill that can improve quality and customer satisfaction while reducing waste, returns, rework, and sanding time by as much as 50%. Do these things sound hokey, or do they sound compelling? Well, if you're someone who cares about content readership, comprehension, and job performance of your audience, the first one ought to hit a home run. And if you're someone who's concerned about quality, customer satisfaction, waste, returns, rework, and sanding time, you likewise ought to get a pretty excited feeling when you hear about what this drill can do. So while you may think that these sound contrived, in fact, if you've done them right, and hopefully you've done them by now, what you've done is say something that is exactly what your prospect wants to hear. And that's the point. As we said before, if you're going to persuade someone to talk even for 3 minutes, then the value of talking has to be seen by the prospect to be greater than the cost of the conversation. This is the first hurdle you have to overcome when you're cold calling, assuming that you've gotten through to the decision maker, and sometimes even not. In our experience, the best way to do that is to show in your initial benefit statement, as virtually the first thing out of your mouth after the pleasantries, that you can improve something that a supposedly qualified prospect should care about in a significant and measurable way. Suggesting that you can improve some function or operation implies, if not explicitly expresses, value. And so the conversation, if you say something relevant, interesting, and compelling in your IBS, becomes worthwhile for the prospect because it represents an opportunity for the prospect to learn how they might improve that function or operation and gain that benefit. As we said before, to be able to make such statements, you start by defining your customer needs based on your company's case histories and other sources. You then define the applications or uses of your product or services to address those needs and thereby improve the various functions and operations of your prospective customers. You then identify the value of improving those functions. Do it in a brainstorming session if you have to, but put a number on it and state it in the form of an IBS. And now you have a reliable way to get the prospect's initial interest and prevent them from saying, "Not interested, click." Okay, so now that you have a way to stimulate your prospect's initial interest, we could move on with scripting the rest of the call. But you've just gone through this elaborate exercise of understanding your customer needs and your value proposition. It would be a shame just to leave it there, as there's a lot of potential in your newfound ability to articulate your value proposition. As it turns out, talking about your value in your opening isn't the only time you have to do it on a cold call, nor is it the only time you have to do it in the sales cycle. Getting the prospect to see your value more thoroughly and more deeply than they can just from hearing an IBS is a major objective of any good cold call. In fact, justifying the sale on the basis of your value is probably 80% of selling in B2B. So as long as we're talking about how to understand it and derive it, we might as well finish the job. So as we said before, your basic value proposition is based on what a customer can gain by using your company's products or services. That is, they generally have some business function or operation that they do, that they may have a problem with, and that they can do faster, better, or cheaper if they use your solution. This might be their sales function, it might be product development, it might be production, operations, maintenance, marketing, HR, software development, financial management, training, onboarding, promotion, litigation, or whatever it is that you can impact and improve in some measurable way. In the next step, you're going to drive that point home by developing a series of custom spreadsheet models that describe exactly how you help. In fact, you're even going to put a dollar value on it. So let's say we're trying to sell a cold calling training program, which, as we said before, can help a sales team increase the number of appointments it gets, improve the quality of those appointments, shorten the sales cycle, and increase the team's close rate. The question is, what does that really mean? As you can see here, any improvement to a business function or operation, even if we're even the least bit clever, easily can be expressed in the form of a simple spreadsheet such as this one that takes you from targeting to revenue production. If you look at what's on the lines that are indented, lines 2, 4, 6, and 8 in this case, you can see what we refer to as the coefficients in the sales function that we think our training can impact. Specifically, there's a relationship, such as on line 5, 6, and 7, between the number of closed sales you're going to get on line 7 and the number of appointments you have on line 5. And that relationship is, in the case without training, that for every 100 appointments you have, you're going to get 20 closes, which means you currently have a close rate of 20% without training. But what we're alleging based on our case histories, if you were to buy and use our cold calling training program, then your close rate would be 30% on line 6 instead of 20%. Now, theoretically, we can say this because on average, past customers for our cold calling training increase their close rate by 50%. So if companies had 100 appointments with a close rate of 20%, and they therefore got 20 sales, was able to increase their close rate by 50% to 30%, they'd get 30 sales. In this case, as you can see, because of other improvements brought about by the training earlier in the process, they're working with 200 appointments instead of 100. So that 30% appointment rate results in 60 new sales instead of 30. But it's that coefficient, that close rate, that we're most interested in this case. That's the thing, along with dials per contact on line 2, the appointment rate on line 4, and the average revenue per sale that our cold calling training can impact directly. And that can change how well their sales function works. Of course, we don't want to lose you with a math lesson, but in case you haven't heard the word coefficients for a while, or remember how these equations or functions work, let me explain what we're talking about, because it's really very simple stuff, and you need to be able to do this for yourself and for your own products. If you recall from high school algebra, the plot of a line is determined by the equation y equals mx plus b, with m being something called the coefficient of x, which determines the slope of the line. B is something called the y-intercept, but we're going to set b to 0, so the equation is effectively y equals mx. And while you probably thought you'd never use this concept, you actually use it. In fact, you probably even think about it every day. For example, if your appointment rate is 10%, which is what's shown by the red line, that's simply the coefficient in the equation that says you get an appointment at about 10% of your dials. Or the number of dials you make times 0.1 equals the number of appointments you get. If you make 200 dials, you expect to get 20 appointments. If you make 300 dials, you expect to get 30 appointments, and so on. Now, if you can somehow increase your appointment rate to, say, 20%, say, with cold calling training, then the equation changes. Now the number of dials you make times 0.2 equals the number of appointments you get, as shown in the green line. Or if you will, if you make 200 dials, you expect to get 40 appointments. 300 dials gets you 60 appointments, and so on. It's these kinds of performance improvements that we're talking about when we talk about how your solution can help your customer. In the case of cold calling training, hopefully we can double your appointment rate so you can get twice as many appointments as before. Or maybe we can help you double the quality of the lead so that the close rate that your sales rep gets improves commensurately as well. In your case, of course, you need to understand the performance factors or coefficients that your products or services can impact for your customer, because that's how they measure your value. Then this is exactly the information that came out of your case histories, so you should have it already, right? In any event, it's all just 9th grade algebra, and now you know why they made you learn it. In your case, of course, you need to understand the performance factors or coefficients that your products or services can impact for your customers, because that's how they'll measure your value. But then this is exactly the same information that came out of your case histories, so you should have it already, right? It's all just 9th grade algebra, and now you know why they made you learn it. But just keep it in mind, as it's going to come up later when making your cold calls and trying to put together that business case for meeting. In any event, let's say a sales team has a territory with 1,000 potential customers in it that they need to target during the quarter, which you can see on line 1. Without the training, it normally takes them 5 tries to get a decision maker on the phone, as you can see on line 2. With the training, however, we're predicting that they will be able to get a decision maker on the phone in an average of 3 tries, because they're going to learn how to get past gatekeepers better, which is a 40% improvement. Consequently, to reach 1,000 decision makers, it normally took 5,000 dials, but in the future, it will only take them 3,000 dials because of the training, which is shown on line 3. Also, as a result of their training, their appointment rate is expected to improve, as you can see on line 4, because they'll become better at uncovering needs, building value, and persuading a prospect to meet. So, with their appointment rate improving from 10% to 20%, the number of initial appointments they're expected to get will go from 100 to 200, which shows up on line 5. Next, as a result of their training, let's say their close rate on line 6 can be expected to go up from 20% to 30% because they're generating better quality leads, uncovering more needs on the way in, and closing more effectively because of their improved ability to unhook competition, resulting in a projected threefold increase in unit sales on line 7 from 20 sales per quarter to 60. Finally, because we know that willingness to pay is directly related to perceived value, we can see that the average revenue per sale on line 8 went up 10% from $10,000 to $11,000, resulting in new revenue for the quarter going up from $200,000 to $660,000, a 330% increase shown on line 9. We call this kind of analysis an economic value to the customer, or EVC model. As you can see, this approach clearly illustrates the operational and financial value of the offering, and so you should now create a couple of these models for your products and services as well. Because ask yourself, if you were to present this kind of analysis to a prospect of yours as a potential outcome that you could help her company achieve, do you think she might be interested? In our experience, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So let's take this a couple of steps farther, such as by calculating the cost impact of the training, which you should also do for your solutions, because even the best of solutions involve added costs somewhere. For example, let's say the prospect tells us that the loaded rate for one of their salespeople is $50 an hour. Without the training, the team churns through their list at a rate of 16 dials per hour, as you can see on line 4. But with the training, we predict that they'll actually make fewer dials per hour because they're going to have more good conversations and they're going to take longer to get through. That's fine, but from a cost perspective, this would seem like a bad thing because it increases their cost for lead generation from $15,625 to $18,750, which you can see on line 5. If in your analysis this happens to you, don't worry, it's not uncommon. That is, if your offering has value, what matters is that you highlight it and get the prospect to see it. But rarely is that value achieved without some cost. Obviously, the product itself has cost, which we haven't factored in yet, but there also may be changes in the way the customer operates that, if viewed in isolation, might look like a negative. That's okay though. As you can see, if you look at those potentially negative cost impacts in the context of a significant improvement in revenue, they clearly don't matter very much. And that's one of the reasons why you build these economic value to the customer, or EVC models, because they give you a chance to show your whole benefit and not just be victimized by your price or any added costs of change or implementation like this that a prospect might otherwise obsess about. In fact, your solution might trigger a whole raft of new costs. For example, in our case, a successful cold calling training program could easily cause an increase in field sales expense, as you can see on lines 8 and 9. This is because if it costs $100 to send someone out on a field sales call, and we're increasing the number of appointments from 100 to 200, then field sales expense is naturally going to increase, in this case from $10,000 to $20,000 as a result of the training. And your solution might also add new costs as well as increase old ones. Clearly, an unimaginative decision maker or someone who doesn't see the big picture might bridle at an initiative that's going to increase costs so much. But you can see where this is going, right? Obviously, in the context of the $460,000 revenue increase they're going to get, even a doubling of field sales expense from $10,000 to $20,000 isn't very much. And of course, they don't have to pay for it if they don't get the appointments, so it's not even a cost unless they actually get the leads they needed. Regardless, only if you can show, either through your words or through a sales aid like this, that the benefits overwhelmingly outweigh the costs, will you be able to get around the objection, whether it's merely your price or it's an added cost that's a direct consequence of implementing your solution. Anyway, we hope you'll agree that this is a great and not too complicated way to show your benefits. If you agree, then you should try to build as many models like this as you need to illustrate your value, either with words or a simple spreadsheet model like this. In any event, adding these kinds of costs now lets us drive all the way back to something we talked about dozens of slides ago, to the pro forma P&L. As you can see here, what we've done is taken the coefficients from our EVC models and simply put them into a pro forma P&L. Obviously, some of the line items are problematic, such as the money they have to invest in our solution on line 6. and increases in some of their expenses on line 3 and 4. But these added costs are clearly overwhelmed by the increase in revenue on line 1 from $1.14 million for the quarter to $3.78 million for the quarter due to the training. In other words, despite the solution's $2,000 price tag on line 6, and despite the fact that the customer may incur some additional expenses on line 3 and 4, they're still going to increase their gross profit on line 7 by almost $900,000, a huge increase over the loss they were otherwise expecting. Would that be a good investment of $2,000? At the very least, it ought to be interesting. And that's the point. Make up a bunch of these models, and you'll have the ultimate measurable benefit to put into your IBS. Now, there are a couple of other points we need to make before we leave this slide. First, keep in mind that your particular solution is naturally going to impact your prospect's pro forma P&L in a way different from this example. You may offer a pure cost reduction and have no impact on revenues. The investment in your solution may be spread out over months or years, in which case you may need multiple columns to show the impact of your solution or use a payback period. And some of the benefits may not be able to be translated into dollars so easily, so you may have to work in different units. But be careful of taking that shortcut. This is because ultimately your prospect has to put a business case together. And if you can't show your benefits in a form that fits into it, they're not going to count in your favor. Finally, don't just create one EBC model. Create several of them and create several different versions of how you can impact your prospect's P&L. Remember, each customer is unique. They have different needs and problems, or at least have different priorities and assumptions. Creating several versions of these models in advance will increase the likelihood that you will have one that fits when you talk to your prospect. In any event, hopefully now you know how to derive an understanding of your customer's needs from your case histories. You know how to extract these customer needs and use them to define and describe your applications, or the ways in which customers use your products and services to satisfy those needs and improve their operations. You now should know how to define your value proposition from those applications and articulate it in the form of an initial benefit statement or 5. You should now know how to quantify your benefits and an economic value to the customer model. And finally, you should know how to illustrate your value using dollars in the form of a pro forma P&L or business case. These are, as we said, the basic tools or prerequisites for putting together an initial benefit statement and for articulating your value proposition. A clearly insane amount of work for something that's going to take you all of 5 or 10 seconds to say. But before we leave this topic, we actually need to talk about one more type of EBC model, the emotional value to the customer model. Even though we're talking about cold calling in the B2B market, the fact of the matter is that when a customer buys something, they often don't only do it for dollars and cents reasons. Sure, you can translate things like quality improvements, faster speed to market, and improved customer satisfaction into lower costs, increased revenue, or lower customer retention expense. But things like these often also have a subjective value as well. For example, things like quality, service, and goodwill are often viewed as objective goods, even if they can't quite be measured. In addition, there are often purely emotional reasons that people buy things or buy them from a particular vendor. They may buy from you because they like you, you're local, or they trust your company. They may be angry at their current vendor or be dissatisfied with their service, or they may feel safer buying from you than someone else who claims that their products are faster, better, or cheaper. The fact that in many cases these justifications can't be quantified, and so they may not be able to be illustrated as easily on a pro forma P&L. Now, a good CFO, especially one who's answerable to shareholders, could easily find a way to quantify these benefits. But most of the people to whom we talk don't have to defend every decision in such a hard-nosed fashion. Rather, they often have representations of value in their mind having to do with comfort level, peace of mind, trust, quality, and other subjective criteria. And they can even act on those justifications. For this reason, it's important to talk about how to express your value in subjective or emotional terms as well as in objective or economic terms. Because this is just the basic course, we're not going to go into all the theory about emotional value, how to uncover needs for it, build it, and represent it. But we do want to show you a few examples in a way that can help you understand and feel comfortable with and maybe take advantage of the concept in your own work. As you can see here, the most obvious point is that we're using pictures to illustrate different messages such as frustration, trust, teamwork, and success. If you like to use the right brain, left brain paradigm, this is clearly a right brain method for communicating, as opposed to the left brain method of the business case. But you can say a lot with a picture and dramatically increase your appeal and your value if you understand and sell the emotional value of your offering too. Clearly, you can't show a picture to a prospect over the phone, but the point here is twofold. First, we don't want you to ignore these benefits. There are often as many real dollars in. So where are we? If you've been keeping up, you've completed the prerequisites you need in order to write your interest-creating remark, or IBS. You've created some case histories, you've identified and analyzed your customer needs, you now know how your customers are going to use your products and how they're going to obtain value from them. You've quantified that value and you've expressed that value in a few mini models that you can drop into a pro forma P&L, which is the format, usually in the form of a business case, that your prospect is going to use to make a decision to talk, meet, or buy. Not bad for a day's work. If you feel more comfortable with this view, you've defined your customer needs, you understand now how your customers are going to use your products to satisfy them, and you now know how they're going to derive value. And since that's how a prospect sees you, you should now be able to see your company as your prospects see it. This brings us back to our high-level view of the call, except now we have something interesting to say to the prospect, an interest-creating remark called an initial benefit statement, or IBS, with a real benefit and a real metric in it that's going to stimulate their initial interest and keep them from hanging up on us and enabling us to get past the stimulate interest decision point. And in case you need to be reminded of what an IBS is, here are a few examples again, except now you've seen how they were made. For example, we provide cold calling training that can enable your sales team to generate 300% more revenue. We provide cold calling training that can reduce your cost per lead by 50% or more. And we provide cold calling training that can double your qualification rate and close rate, cut your sales cycle in half, and increase the number of reps who make quota by 33% or more. And just to remind you that this is the same approach that works for other products and services, here are two more that we talked about before. We provide content distribution systems that enhance information flow, quadruple readership, boost comprehension by 30%, improve job performance, and reduce project cycle time by 25% or more. We make a drill that can improve quality and customer satisfaction while reducing waste, returns, rework, and sanding time by as much as 50%. As you can see, each of these includes a brief description of the product, but more prominent are the descriptions of the benefits. So finally, before we leave this topic, let's just review the basic format of a good IBS. There are a couple of options, but the basic format is we provide such and such a solution to such and such a problem that can deliver this benefit, and this other benefit, while reducing this cost, that pain, and such a problem. You can also add resulting in this value or that ultimate benefit if you want, but that's the gist of the message. There are lots of ways to word your IBSs, but there are a few things to always keep in mind. First, try as hard as you can to include some number or metric in your IBS, some percent improvement in some meaningful function, some numerical gain of a good thing, or a measurable reduction in a bad thing. By putting a number in it, it engages the left side of the brain as much as using a picture engaged the right side of the brain a moment ago. Second, write up more than one of these. 5 is good, 10 is better. You will use these in the beginning of your call to stimulate initial interest, and you will use them again when you state the purpose of your call and when the prospect asks what you do. They're also useful for voicemail messages, cover notes on your emails, and framing your objection handles. Third, keep them short, as brevity is the soul of wit. It's also what keeps the prospect from falling asleep. Finally, note that these represent the core of your value proposition before you know what the prospect actually values. That's their purpose. Once you know what really matters to your prospect because you've uncovered their needs, solving those needs becomes your new value proposition and your old IBS becomes irrelevant. But now at least you have something with which to go to market. If we now go back to our high-level view of the cold call, you can see that you just spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what you can say to the prospect in the first 15 seconds of the call to get them to want to stay on the phone, while also coming up with a couple of good reasons why someone ought to talk with you, meet with you, and ultimately decide to buy from you. If you've been doing the exercises, therefore, you're halfway home. Not to mince words, this is a big deal in cold calling, as it is the single biggest point of failure for the vast majority of cold calling programs, especially because, as you can see, you usually don't get a second chance to make a first impression. But if you now feel comfortable that you have some things that are really interesting to say about your products or services, and you understand the decision process you're selling into, congratulations. That's the hardest part of what you have to do. If you're having trouble, call us, but you can now start designing your cold calling program. You're done with your prerequisites.